there. Ready for today's deep dive? We're going to explore something pretty amazing. The connection between your body and your mind. You know, how what you do physically can actually shape the way you think and feel.
It's easy to go through life without really thinking about it.
Right. Like it's all happening automatically.
We move, we feel, we think, but
Yeah.
rarely stop to consider how deeply intertwined all of that really is.
Okay, so let's start with something I think we're all familiar with. Body image. You know, how we see ourselves, how we think about our bodies.
Exactly. And while body image is how we perceive ourselves on the outside, there's this whole other concept called body schema, which is more about the behind-the-scenes action.
Body schema. Okay, now that's a new one for me.
Think of it like this. Your body schema is like an internal GPS system for your body.
Okay.
It's what allows you to move through the world without constantly bumping into things or tripping over your own feet. It's your brain's way of keeping track of where your body is in space and how it's moving.
So when I'm weaving through a crowded room, dodging people and not even thinking about it, that's my body schema in action.
Precisely. It's working behind the scenes, coordinating your movements and spatial awareness without you even realizing it.
Wow.
And to really grasp how crucial it is, let's talk about a truly remarkable case study. Have you ever heard of Ian Waterman?
Ian Waterman, I don't think so.
Ian's story is incredible. He contracted a rare virus that attacked his nervous system and essentially destroyed his sense of proprioception.
Proprioception, that's a big word.
It is. Basically, it's your body's internal sense of where your limbs are in space. It's how you know if your arm is bent or straight without having to look at it.
Oh, okay.
You know that feeling when you're walking in the dark and you can just tell where to put your foot without looking? That's proprioception.
Okay, got it. So poor Ian, he lost his sense of where his body was in space. I can't even
It
imagine.
was completely debilitating. Imagine waking up one day and you literally cannot feel your limbs. Even the simplest tasks, like reaching for a cup, became impossible for Ian because his brain was no longer receiving any feedback from his muscles and joints.
That's both fascinating and terrifying. So how did he ever function?
Well, here's the amazing part. Ian learned to control his movements again, but he had to do it by relying entirely on his vision. He had to constantly watch his limbs to tell his brain what they were doing. It was like learning to walk all over again. But this time, he was consciously planning every single movement.
Wow, so his brain basically rewired itself to use his sight to compensate for the loss of feeling. That's incredible.
It really is. It highlights something called cross-modal communication, which basically means that our senses can sometimes step in to fill in the gaps when one sense is missing. Ian's story is a testament to the amazing plasticity of the brain, its ability to adapt and change in response to experience.
It makes you realize how much we take for granted. Like our brains are working overtime and we don't even realize it.
It's true.
So we've seen how important body schema is for adults. But what about babies? Do they come into the world with this internal GPS system already up and running?
That's a great question. It leads us to another fascinating phenomenon, neonatal imitation. You know how babies, literally just hours old, can already imitate facial expressions, like sticking out their tongues?
Yeah, it's so cute and also kind of freaky. How do they even do that?
Researchers like Meltoff and Moore did these groundbreaking studies showing that newborns really can mimic facial gestures. And to do that, they have to have some rudimentary sense of their own face and how to move it. That suggests that body schema, at least in some basic form, is already present at birth.
So even as tiny babies, we have this sense of our bodies as separate from the rest of the world. That's wild, but doesn't that also depend on vision?
Right.
And I thought babies' eyesight wasn't that great when they're first born.
That's a common misconception.
Oh?
While it's true that a newborn's visual cortex isn't fully developed, they still have some pretty impressive visual abilities right from the get-go. They can see things up close with decent clarity, they're sensitive to contrasts, and perhaps most importantly, they have something called shape constancy. Shape constancy means they can recognize the actual shape of an object, even as it moves or rotates.
So like if you show a baby a ball, they know it's still a ball even when it's rolling away from them.
Exactly. That's a pretty complex visual skill, and it suggests that babies are already processing visual information in a pretty sophisticated way, even with a developing visual cortex.
And that ties back to the whole neonatal imitation thing, right? They're not just seeing a tongue sticking out, they're understanding that it's a tongue and that their tongue can do that too.
Precisely. It hints at this incredible interplay between what they're seeing and their own internal sense of their bodies. This is where we get into intermodal perception.
Okay, intermodal perception. Break that down for me.
It's how our different senses work together, like a team, to create a unified experience. Think about a newborn recognizing their mother's voice. It's not just about hearing. There's a visual component too, a mental picture of mom, maybe even a scent associated with her.
So our senses aren't isolated. They're all feeding into each other.
Right. And that brings us back to body schema and this idea that our physical selves profoundly influence how our minds make sense of the world. It's not just about the movements we make, but how our brains take in information through our senses and weave it into a coherent experience.
It's like our bodies are the instruments through which we experience the world, and our brains are the conductors, making sense of all the different sounds. Okay, I like that analogy.
And speaking of how our brains make sense of things, let's move on to something even more fundamental. Our sense of self. That feeling of me, which seems so basic, so effortless.
It's funny you say effortless because I really never stopped to think about it. It just susseslay,
Exactly. But there's actually a lot going on under the surface to create that sense of me. We're talking about things like sense of agency and sense of ownership.
Okay, those sound like terms from a philosophy class.
Maybe, but they're actually pretty straightforward. Sense of agency is the feeling of being in control of our actions. It's the I am the one making this happen feeling. And sense of ownership is simply recognizing our body as our own.
So agency is about control and ownership is about belonging. Two sides of the same me coin.
Exactly. And these experiences usually happen seamlessly. But there are situations where they can diverge. Think about those times when you get a sudden muscle spasm.
Oh, yeah.
You definitely have a sense of ownership. It's your leg that's twitching, but you lack agency. You're not consciously controlling that movement.
Oh, that makes total sense. It's like your body is doing its own thing.
Precisely. And this distinction becomes even more interesting when we consider conditions like schizophrenia.
The schizophrenia.
How so? Well, some individuals with schizophrenia experience what's called thought insertion, this unsettling feeling that thoughts are being put into their minds from an outside source. Or they might have delusions of control, where it feels like someone else is controlling their body.
That must be terrifying. Like your sense of self is being hijacked.
It's a profound disruption of agency and ownership. And while we're still trying to fully understand these experiences, there are some interesting theories out there. One model, developed by neuroscientist Christopher Frith, suggests that our brains have these things called comparators.
Comparators? Like what athletes used to see who's faster?
Kind of. In the brain, comparators are like internal referees. They constantly monitor our intentions, what we want to do, and the actual outcomes of our actions. They make sure things are lining up.
So it's like an internal feedback loop. The brain is checking in with itself, making sure everything is going according to plan.
Exactly. But Frith suggests that in schizophrenia, these comparators might be malfunctioning. There's a disconnect between intentions and outcomes. The brain registers an action, but without that feeling of, I meant to do that.
So the brain is misinterpreting its own signals?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
This mismatch between what we intend to do and what our bodies actually do could explain those experiences of alien control.
It's like the brain is experiencing a glitch in the matrix. But you said there were other theories.
There are. Another model focuses on something called the pretensional structure of consciousness, which sounds very complicated.
It does.
But it's actually a really cool concept. Basically, pretension refers to our brain's amazing ability to constantly anticipate what's coming next. It's why we can understand a sentence as it's being spoken or catch a ball that's thrown to us. Our brains are always a step ahead, predicting the flow of experience based on past experiences.
So we're all secretly psychic.
In a way. Now imagine that this pretensional structure, this ability to anticipate, is disrupted. Suddenly, experiences feel like they're just happening to you, without any sense of expectation or control.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. If you can't anticipate your own actions, your own thoughts, it might feel like they're coming from somewhere else.
Exactly. This model suggests that schizophrenia might involve a disruption of this fundamental anticipatory process, leading to those feelings of alien control or thought insertion.
Wow. So it's not just about the content of our thoughts, but the very structure of our conscious experience that shapes our sense of self.
Precisely. And this has huge implications for how we approach the study and treatment of conditions like schizophrenia. We need to move beyond just labeling experiences as delusions and really try to understand the underlying mechanisms that give rise to them.
It's about treating the whole person, not just the symptoms, right?
Exactly. And on that note of understanding the whole person, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how we understand other people. Gallagher delves into something called the theory of mind, which is all about how we perceive and interpret the mental states of others.
So, how we figure out what other people are thinking and feeling, we're all amateur mind readers.
In a way, the theory of mind, or TOM, suggests that we essentially build mental models of other people's minds. We try to figure out their beliefs, desires, intentions, and emotions to understand their actions and predict their behavior.
That makes sense. We're always trying to figure out what makes people tick.
Right. But while Tom has been a dominant theory in psychology for a while, Gallagher presents some alternative perspectives too. He points out that Tom can sometimes seem overly intellectualized, like we're constantly running complex simulations in our heads just to understand a simple interaction.
So it's not just about cold, hard calculations.
Exactly. Tom doesn't fully capture the immediacy, the intuitiveness of so much of social interaction. Think about how you instantly understand a friend's facial expression or how you react to someone's tone of voice. These things happen so quickly without us consciously analyzing every detail.
It's more like a gut feeling, like you just know what someone is feeling.
Exactly. And that's where Gallagher's emphasis on embodiment comes into play again. He argues that our understanding of others is deeply rooted in our own bodily experiences. We understand others in part because we share similar bodies and we move through the world in similar ways.
It's like that saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
Yes, we understand empathy and compassion because we've experienced those emotions in our own bodies.
So it's not just about what's going on in our heads, it's about the whole embodied experience of being in the world with other people.
Exactly. And this leads to a really interesting discussion about autism.
Autism. I'm really interested in hearing more about this.
Well, autism is often characterized by difficulties in social understanding. And for a long time, the dominant theory was that autistic individuals have a theory of mind deficit. Basically, they struggle to understand other people's mental states.
I've heard about that. They do those experiments where they show a child a box that's supposed to have crayons but actually has candles inside.
Yes, it's called the false belief task. They ask the child what someone else who hasn't seen inside the box would think is in there. Typically, developing children will say crayons, but children with autism often say candles.
Because they have a hard time understanding that someone else might have a different belief than they do.
Exactly. And this was taken as evidence for a Tom deficit. However, Gallagher, along with many autism researchers, is challenging this narrow view. He argues that reducing autism to a single cognitive deficit overlooks the incredible diversity of the autistic experience.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
That's not at all. Gallagher highlights other autistic characteristics like sensory sensitivities, a need for sameness, and challenges with central coherence, the ability to see the bigger picture and connect details to a larger context. And he argues that these other characteristics, which are often seen as separate from social cognition, can actually play a significant role in shaping social understanding in autism.
So it's about looking at the whole picture, not just focusing on one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. He uses the example of Temple Grandin, a prominent autistic individual who describes her thinking as thinking in pictures. She's talked about how her sensory sensitivities, which can sometimes be overwhelming, also give her a unique way of perceiving the world.
That's fascinating. So rather than seeing these other characteristics as deficits, we can see them as different ways of experiencing and understanding the world. It really makes you realize how much we still don't know about the brain and how it works.
Absolutely. The field of embodiment is constantly evolving. It's exciting because as we uncover more about these intricate connections between body and mind, we're also challenged to rethink some of our old theories and come up with new ways of understanding the human experience.
It's like we're redrawing the map of what it means to be human, and Gallagher's book really brings that home. He's showing us how embodiment shapes everything from our senses and movements to our sense of self, and even how we connect with other people.
And this shift in perspective has big implications for all sorts of fields, not just psychology and neuroscience. We're talking about education, design, even artificial intelligence.
Okay, so let's talk about the practical applications of all this. How can we use this understanding of embodiment to actually improve people's lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Well, one key takeaway is the importance of creating environments that support the natural interplay between body and mind. For example, instead of forcing kids to sit still all day in school, what if we design classrooms that encourage more movement and sensory exploration?
It's like, let them fidget, let them move, let them learn in a way that feels natural to their bodies.
Exactly. And it's not just about kids. Think about workspaces that are designed to get people up and moving throughout the day. Less sitting, more doing. It's good for our physical health, and it can have a huge impact on our mental well-being too.
We've become so sedentary, our poor bodies weren't meant for this.
Right. And this understanding of embodiment can even change how we approach healthcare. We can start thinking about therapies that incorporate movement, touch, sensory stimulation.
Mm.
We need to see the body as an active participant in the healing process, not just something that houses a brain that needs fixing.
It's about treating the whole person, not just the illness. I love that.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about technology. As we rely more and more on devices and digital interfaces, it's crucial to design those things in a way that's intuitive and embodied.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, think about virtual reality for a second. It has the potential to create these incredibly immersive and embodied experiences, but we have to design those experiences in a way that respects how our bodies naturally move and perceive the world. Otherwise, we end up with technology that's awkward, disorienting, maybe even makes us sick.
It's about making technology work for us, not the other way around. That makes so much sense.
And this brings us back to something you mentioned earlier about autism. We can apply this understanding of embodiment to better support individuals with autism and other sensory processing differences.
That's something I'm really passionate about. So often these individuals are seen through a deficit-based lens. It's
Yeah,
all about what they can't do, rather than focusing on their strengths and unique ways of experiencing the world.
exactly. Gallagher's work encourages us to move beyond those limited views. Instead of trying to fix or normalize these individuals, what if we focus on creating environments and technologies that support their needs and allow them to thrive?
We need to design with neurodiversity in mind.
Exactly. That might look like creating sensory-friendly spaces that minimize overwhelming stimuli, or designing educational approaches that are tailored to different learning styles and sensory preferences. It's about recognizing that there's no one right way to experience the world.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how my body shapes my experience, but it also feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are. The exploration of embodiment is just beginning, and it's an incredibly rich and multifaceted field. There's still so much to discover about how our physical selves interact with our thoughts, emotions, and relationships.
It makes you realize that the mind-body connection isn't just some abstract concept, it's at play in every aspect of our lives.
Exactly. It's shaping how we move through the world, how we connect with others, how we experience being alive.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the world of embodiment. It's been a truly mind-expanding experience.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thanks for diving in with us. We hope you've learned something new about the amazing connection between your body and your mind. And remember, the exploration doesn't end here. Keep asking questions, keep learning, keep diving deep.